In the name of the cosmic totality that defines our reality, we are starting this next session as a follow-up to the one before, obviously, where we were discussing the perception of Islam in history. And this obviously is an overview, and in the previous program, I referred to first a division along the timeline. The first period is the year 570 to 661 CE, the Rashidun period, which we discussed sufficiently in the last program. Today's program will concentrate on the second period, which is the year 661 to 750, the Umayyad period. I will share with you the outline for the remainder periods of this series, which will then shift into gear with the third session, or at least the third segment in this discussion, covering the years 750 to the 1500s, which is the civilizational aspect of the Islamic world, and there we will again emphasize more on the perception of what the word Islam connotes and denotes, and how it's perceived, understood or misunderstood, resented, resisted, liked, and then we will move on to the subsequent periods, which will be from the 1500s to 1913, the beginning of the European War, and that will be basically the period of the decline, first starting in the 1500s in a rather slow manner, but then it speeds up as colonialism picks up its expansive policies around the world, and primarily around the Muslim societies. This decline is followed by a period that I have termed as the reprieve, 1913 to 1989, where the focus of attention of the traditional East-West rivalry somehow shifted away from Islam as the focus to communism as the focus, as the nemesis, as the enemy, as the other from a Western perspective. The last period will be the 1989 to the present, which can be summed up as the period of the turmoil. So we will go now back to the main focus of today's discussion, which is the Umayyad period. The Umayyads came to power in the year 660-61 or thereabouts, and lasted for almost a century, until the year 750. The dynasty takes its name from the Umayyad clan of the Quraysh, the rivals of the Bani Hashims, and it is rightfully called the Umayyad because the emphasis or its identification stems from its tribal background. The Caliphal period of the Medina Republic was a setting of an ideological slash religious, and I must say a multi-religious, diverse community. But towards the end of that period, as we went through the caliphates of Abu Bakr Siddiq, the first caliph, and then subsequently Omar, the second caliph, who probably more than anyone defined that period in terms of creating a very strong, powerful administration, giving it the sense of authority that was absent from that part of the political map of Arabia. Yes, the expansion also occurred during this period, but more than anything, it was the establishment of an administration, the establishment of a social welfare system, the establishment of a calendar defining Muslim society for then and for the years and centuries to come. He is known as Omar al-Faruq, the discerner, and in that he took bold steps towards establishing a set of norms that were not known at the time, the emphasis being on meritocracy, whether it was in the appointment of judges and administrators or in the appointment of military commanders. He sort of broke every mold that existed. For example, appointing an 18-year-old as the commander of the Muslim armies to face Byzantium, the superpower of the time, something totally unheard of. The idea was that it is the new order based on not necessarily on the tribal hierarchies, which is probably what he wanted to avoid. That if Islam as a state, as a polity, as a pluralistic society had to be defended, then it should be defended based on a new order, on meritocracy, rather than a tribal, hierarchical, traditionally structured norm. He also established the norms of an acceptance of the other, and the other here insofar as the religious identity is concerned. For instance, when the Muslims went to Jerusalem, the Christians felt threatened, not as a political entity, but rather they felt threatened because they thought this was a new empire expanding, and they felt it being a threat to their religion. But the second Caliph Omar went personally, and when he had a meeting with the Archbishop in the great church in Jerusalem, at the end of the meeting, the Archbishop was so impressed, not by his leadership alone, but by the fact that there was so much congruence, commonality, and convergence of ideas between this new religion, Islam, and Christianity. And so he suggested to Caliph Omar that because there's so much in common between the two, perhaps it will be a good idea if the Archbishop and the Caliph prayed together inside the church. And Caliph Omar did one better by saying that this is a wonderful idea, but for you and I to be praying inside the church while the Muslim community and the Christian community outside of church are kind of standing in a state of tension and fear and possibly a misunderstanding of each other. Will they believe that we prayed together? Perhaps they won't. So Caliph Omar suggested, yes, I will pray with you as a Christian and as a Muslim, but not here in the church, rather outside and open, so all can see us, that we worship one God and we are one. And that set in motion, a period of the easing of the tensions and the coming together of these different religious communities that, as far as they were concerned, were not that different at all. Very, very positive step. And Omar was followed again when he was on his deathbed. His succession was suggested, and of course he lived as a man who did not believe in having bodyguards, and he said, if I rule with authority in a just way and treat every one of the citizens with dignity, I should not fear for my life. And he didn't. However, there were those who were bent on doing malice, and an attempt was made on his life, and he was wounded. And on his deathbed, he convened a council to appoint his successor. And when they brought him a list of the possible candidates to succeed him, that list included the name of his son, who was probably among the others equally qualified. And the only change he made was he crossed out his son's name and gave the list back. And he said, now you can choose from among these. And the significance of that was to eliminate any possibility or potential for political power as a caliph to be hereditary. That's what they fought against in the caliphal period. He was succeeded by Caliph Osman and then by Caliph Ali. However, Ali's rule was challenged by the governor of Damascus, and that ended into led to the greatest catastrophe in Islamic history, where the Umayyad mindset was set on a rulership based on dynastic powers, on tribal loyalties, on establishing an Arab empire, whereas Khalifa Ali's idea was not to deviate from the norms that were set by the Prophet, and not to deviate from the norms upon which his predecessors had established the governance, which was meritocracy and not tribalism. Unfortunately, the dark forces eventually won the day at the cost of a lot of life, and at the but more significantly, the loss of the caliphal period. And so, with the coming to power through basically through a coup of the Umayyads, was an establishment of an Arab empire, plain and simple. I must say that when I'm mentioning Ali's title as the Caliph, Ali was both a Caliph and an Imam. The context of our discussion demands that I call him a Caliph because that's what we are focusing on. As an Imam, his authority, his knowledge, and his depth and insight is a totally different issue, which can be discussed in a different program. This is not merely a historical review, rather an overview of the perception of Islam, how Islam was perceived. Going back to the Umayyads. The Umayyads they contributed to the history of Islam in both a positive and a negative way. The negativity was that the Arabs who saw under the Umayyads that the two superpowers that had exhausted each other, the Persians and Byzantium to the north and northwest, that the Persians and the Byzantium that had at that time defined the East-West rivalry. And this East-West rivalry was devastating for others, but more so for the Persians and for the Eastern Romans themselves. They went through centuries of wars. They taxed their people, both to finance their military campaigns against one another, but also taxing them by force drafting them into these two armies. And that whole period before the advent of Islam, one of an endless bloodshed of Persians and Eastern Romans fighting it out without any conclusive result at the end. By inconclusive, I mean that at the end the Persian Empire was still a Persian Empire and Byzantium was still Byzantium. In other words, they could not eliminate each other. And so since their powers were pretty balanced, this was the main cause of the devastation, that since they could not eliminate one another, they could weaken each other. And as they weakened each other, they weakened themselves. This was a very, very horrible period in human history. And of course, it wasn't without its precedence, because the Achaemenids before were pretty much doing the same thing in this East-West rivalry. But it became much more heightened, much more defined during Byzantium period, perhaps in a similar way that the earlier Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, were engaged with the Greeks, which also resulted eventually with the fall of the Persian Empire and the death and destruction and demise of the whole Persian East in the period of Alexander the Great and his expansion eastward. So for some reason, the what is called the Middle East, which is not the middle of anywhere, but rather a zone of both continental convergence of Asia, Europe, and Africa, as well as a bridge that connects these continents, not so much as continents, but the more well-defined cultural backgrounds, whether it's the Indians or the Persians and the Greeks or the Romans and Byzantium and Egypt and so on and so forth. They all come together in the Eastern Mediterranean zone. And to this day, in the 21st century, the East-West rivalry somehow goes back to that. But we'll come to that later. So going back to the Umayyads, realizing that the Persian Empire had already collapsed and that Byzantium was rather weak and weakened by the rivalry, they saw the opportunity of establishing an alternative empire which will be an Arab empire in character. The problem we have historically is that the Arab nomads of the Arabian Peninsula, who were basically nobodies as far as world politics was concerned, had suddenly become a significant force. And that force in the Caliphal period was one of the emergence of a new faith, of a new ideology, of a new vitality. And rightly or wrongly, two words became synonymous with one another: Islam and Arabia, Muslims and Arabs. And although, as we explained in the previous program, Islam was a universality in its own right, as any religious faith would be. A faith community cannot be tribal or national or parochial, but rather universal due to its message. But the mindset of the average person in this hub of activities of the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, Southwest Asia, Southeast Europe, was such that Arabs were considered Muslims, Muslims Arabs, and that precluded everyone else. Now, the Umayyads took advantage of this more by default than by design, that they wanted to establish an Arab empire, and if Arabs were equated with Islam, so be it. And before you know it, the part of the world that we know today as the Muslim world came under their power. We can go to, let's see, Arabia proper. That came under the power of the Umayyads. Mesopotamia, Persia, Levant, Egypt, Maghrib, Al-Andalus, Transoxiana, Hindustan or India, and Anatolia. This is indeed a tall order in terms of the empires that existed, and now the Umayyads are basically controlling them all. So yes, it did become a global empire. But since the discussion we have is based on, is centered on the perception of Islam, then it's their expansionist militaristic policies that were seen by many, particularly in the West, as a threat. The Eastern Roman-Persian rivalry was not based on a religious competition with each other, but rather of a cultural one. So while religion was very important to the Eastern Romans, to Byzantium, the Persians used religion and manipulated it, but they did not have the sense of a mission in the religious context as much as the Christians did. So the Christians somehow were identified as one of the earliest missionary faith communities. But like I said, but the conflict between Byzantium and Persia did not have that element because it wasn't reciprocated by the Persians as such. The reason being, among other things, that Zoroastrianism, which was the official religion of Persia, of the Sassanids at the time, was rather on a decline, whereas Christianity, and by Christianity I mean Eastern Orthodoxy, and by that I mean Hellenic Christianity of the Eastern Orthodox type that Constantine established in Byzantium, was rather a dynamic force. It was increasingly becoming dominant in politics and the policies of Byzantium, whereas Zoroastrianism among the Sassanid Persians was not so. Yes, of course, religions are always manipulated by politicians. That there is no denying of that. But to make a comparison between what religion meant to the Persian Sassanids versus what it meant to the Eastern Romans in Byzantium, there was a drastic difference. Now, with the fall of Persia and the establishment of the Umayyad, who were then out of a necessity defined as a religious community, a religious empire, because, as I said earlier, because of the establishment of equivalency between Islam and Arab, or Muslims and Arabs, that resulted in that East-West rivalry between the Greeks and the Achaemenids, between Byzantium and Persian, became one between a Christian Europe or a Christian West and a Muslim East. And suddenly religion was thrusted into the forefront, because now the dynamism, the religious dynamism, the religious fervor of the Christians in Byzantium was challenged by the religious dynamism of Islam. Even though the Umayyad could not be their representatives, they nonetheless could not deny that. So for one reason or another, and perhaps for the best reason we just shared, this political rivalry suddenly grew its ideological dimension as well as its religious identification as a source of the very source of that rivalry. And because of that, the expansion of the Umayyads, especially in the West, in Christian West, in Europe, was perceived as a threat, not to the polity and the leadership, but rather as a threat to their religion as well. And so what has been haunting Europe to this day, and I mean the 21st century, and by Europe I mean Europe and European descendants, that would be Americans, Australians, and the Western European culture in general, is that ever since Islam has been seen as a threat. So when we hear the Muslim threat from the East today in the media, that is nothing new. It had gained popularity in that early period with the rise of the Umayyads, 661, and the decades following that, and it had been manipulated in the same tone of voice by politicians on both sides. So Donald Trump is not saying anything new now, as the popes and the politicians of previous centuries would have been saying. And from the opposite side, what ISIS is saying as establishing an Islamic state by the sword is not any different than what the Umayyads wanted to do, to establish a quote-unquote Islamic state by the sword, which in essence was nothing but an Arab empire. And so in that regard then, the stereotype terminologies that we all suffer from to this day, spreading Islam by the sword, is more representative of the Umayyad period than of any other period. They expanded an empire by the sword and called it the expansion of Islam by the sword. And nothing can be farther from truth in the sense that Islam does not allow for coercion in matters of faith. That's a clear command of the Quran, chapter 2, verse 256. And what the Umayyad did was that they turned that on its head. That coercion that was forbidden by the Quran, in essence, became a norm for the Umayyads. Not that they were really interested in the conversion. Let me explain that. They were not interested in converting people, but they were trying to label their empire Islamic so that they will benefit from its immunities to criticism in some ways. But other than that, they charged on and expanded as empire. And I gave you the name of the regions, which is basically, except for the Indian subcontinent, where their expansion was rather limited, and further east, Bangladesh, Indonesia, in the Far East. But in the rest of the present-day Muslim world, their presence was felt, and people suffered under their administration. So not only the Westerners, the Western Christians in Europe disliked Arabs as this imperial expanding force, but there was an equal amount of resentment in the East, in Central Asia, in Persia, Afghanistan, and beyond, that in the historical context, that resentment that was recorded at the time against the Arabization of the region was felt. And let me explain why the Umayyads were not interested in conversion of people into Islam, by force or otherwise. As I said, they were interested in establishing an Arab empire. Empires need armies. Armies need money and resources. Under in an Islamic setting, an adherent to the faith of Islam has to exercise his or her freedom, that insofar as the distributive element of his or her wealth is concerned, they are to share. Sharing your wealth is very highly recommended. In fact, it's one of the 5 pillars of the faith. So if you're a Muslim, you're supposed to help the poor, the needy, and the destitute. And this giving, known as zakat, is a norm It's one of the pillars, and it is the prerogative of the one who gives to decide where and on what project that money should be spent. And this, in a way, denies the government to issue taxes on them. So in an imperial power, in an imperial state, or in an imperial order, you need the people to pay taxes to the coffers of the rulers, which is left at their discretion to spend as they wish. And we know from historical records how they would rather spend the money. So the Umayyads had a conflict of interest with people converting into Islam, because the more they converted, the more they were entitled to enjoy the freedom of spending their money as they wished, rather than to give that money to the government. And so what is not understood in history often is that by calling the Umayyads an Islamic empire, then we go to the evidence and find out, for instance, that in Farghana, in parts of Central Asia, at one time, it is reported that more than 20,000 people were pleading with the Arab governor, and it might have been in Balkh, but it was in Central Asia. They were pleading with the governor, asking him to allow them to convert to Islam en masse. And the governor would not give permission because he had to consult the Caliph. Yes, the title remained, the Caliph in Damascus. And the Caliph in Damascus, the Umayyad Caliph in Damascus, was no less than an emperor whose interests were in conflict with these conversions, and therefore would not grant them the permission. Just think about it. Not grant these people the permission to convert. So at one point, when that massive throng of people, the 20,000 or so reported, who pleaded with the governor, and the governor sent a perhaps more as a matter of pretense than of sincerity. He sent a letter to Damascus that here are these people, they want to convert. Should I allow them or not? At that time, there is a change of government in Damascus, and the new Umayyad Caliph, Umar II, has gotten to the helm of the Umayyad dynasty, and he is called the second Umar. I should correct what I said earlier, not Umar II, but the second Umar, to link him in terms of his piety to Caliph Umar II, Caliph of the Caliphal period. And sure enough, this pious man then sent a note back to the governor in Central Asia, asking him that upon receiving this response, you should allow anyone who wants to become a Muslim to exercise their free choice. But to sum up then, we could say that prior to that, and perhaps subsequently, because that remained to be more of an exception during the Umayyad period rather than the norm, that Islam was perceived as a threat both in the East and in the West, a threat to their political structure, to their political order, and these Arab rulers were not interested in matters of faith, and they were simply interested in collecting taxes and collecting armies and expanding further and further. This, as I said, was the negative part of it. The positive dimension of the Umayyads was that as the Persian and Byzantium empires had either disappeared or were on the verge of disappearance, the new order was established under the Umayyads to give it a sense of uniformity. And this new order was expansive in every sense of the word, perhaps with the exception of the Mongol Empire. No other human empire had that breadth, geographic breadth I'm talking about, of being a truly three continental expanded empire that had reached beyond the Pyrenees in the Iberian Peninsula, headed further north towards Paris, to the Kashgar and the modern day Xinjiang or Chinese Turkestan in the east, and into the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, Caucasia, and beyond. And so therefore, if we actually look at the map of the Umayyads, that map eventually became known or is seen as the Muslim empire. So, like I said, it established this new order, and yes, it wasn't the ideal order that it ought to have been, because the more powerful the Umayyads became, they lost that fervor of establishing Islam as this new dynamic faith, this new ideology, this new religion, the new scripture, and all the rest of it that eventually became identifiable trademarks of the Muslim world. But there was that dent, that regression, that going backwards during the Umayyad period. And let's leave this session with that conclusion that I just made, that the Umayyads had both its positive and its negative. The perception was that the non-Arabs generally saw them as a threat, and since the threat of the Arabs were perceived to be synonymous as the threat of Islam, then the more religiously oriented European Eastern Romans became kind of very apprehensive, to put it mildly. And unfortunately, that apprehension that then translated into serious tension, and this tension then replaced the other East-West rivalry, so that instead of the Persians, now the Muslims enter that East-West rivalry. That has defined the world history, at least in the context of Muslim-Christian relations, to this day. That was set in motion, those tensions, those rivalries, the distrust, and the rest. That even though subsequently efforts were made to rectify that, but as religions are always ripe for manipulation, there were always rulers with the very dark shadow side in their character on both sides, that manipulated this into devastating effects, whether we talk about the Umayyad period or we talk about the subsequent periods through the Crusades and the Mongols and the colonial period and the Age of Discovery and the rest of it. All of that is tainted, including the age of slavery, which I think should rightly be called so, because that was kind of a main effort, at least by the West, to kind of target Muslims in Africa primarily for slavery because of what they believed in and how they looked like and where they lived, that three-dimensional aspect of it. So at the end, I will share with you the map of the Umayyad expansion, and I hope that I've not misspoken much in this overview, as I'm relying primarily on my general knowledge and understanding of history, which of course is limited. At this point, I leave you with the thought as this world could have been different had we designed it through our idealism. But alas, that reality spells things differently. Have a nice day.